In January 1946, only months before the Special Operations Executive was due to be dissolved, there was a fire at its Baker Street headquarters. The fire took with it many of SOE's secret files. No one will ever know for sure the full extent of their agents' activities and achievements. And never were their achievements greater than in 1944. A force of only a few thousand worked with the resistance to pave the way for D-Day with enormous personal risk. 1 in 4 died. These are the personal accounts of 6 agents that survived. In the summer of 1944, 1 million men would be landed on the heavily defended beaches of Normandy. If the Germans were able to rush in reinforcements from around Europe, there would be a bloodbath. SOE's task was to stop this happening. Across occupied Europe, there was a feeling that the end of the war was in sight, and underground resistance organizations were rising up. But they were untrained and disorganized. SOE had to pull them together and coordinate their attacks. It had to supply them with arms, ammunition, and explosives. It would be a guerrilla war on an unprecedented scale. In the weeks before D-Day, dozens of new agents were dropped into France to work with the resistance. Yvonne Baisden, 22 years old and half French, was keen to see action. She'd been rejected by de Gaulle's Free French Army because she was half English. SOE spotted her and trained her as a radio operator. Now, having been dropped into France, she was traveling with false papers to meet her contact.
I was very worried that maybe it was noticeable that I'd come from England. There was always a possibility that one would give oneself away. Throughout, there were identity checks in the train, but I had my papers in order. It was difficult to relax or even fall asleep. It seemed to be a very long journey.
She arrived at Dole in eastern France. She was met and taken to her safe house, a cheese depot. Lucien, the agent in charge of the mission, was keen to get started.
Lucien was very anxious to get in touch with London, so that was more or less my first job as soon as I arrived.
Lucien and Baisden were organizing massive nighttime drops of arms and explosives, which would go straight to the resistance. Meanwhile, other SOE agents were making contact with the thousands of young men hiding in the forests and mountains to avoid being sent off to Germany to work in the factories. They were called the Maquis. Politically, they were a volatile mixture, but SOE wanted them to work together for D-Day. Agents were sent in. George Miller asked his father, a High Court judge, to pull strings to get him into SOE. He was dropped into eastern France a few days before D-Day. His mission was to stop German reinforcements reaching Normandy. He had no idea what caliber of men he would be dealing with.
They proved to be very much to my taste. They were young men, very keen indeed. One of them, Maurice, was a tough young man. He was a communist, but we didn't discuss whether people were Gaullist or what the bloody hell they were. We just had a rule, no politics in the Maquis.
Much to Miller's delight, he found that his Maquis was sitting on a plane load of arms and explosives, which they'd hidden in a cave.
They had kept this stuff for 2 years. It was all in perfect condition. I got them to shift it down, and I started straight away on sabotage. I took the Maquis into Besançon station, ready to hide if German patrols came along. There were 16 railway lines coming into the station, and we wanted to do the lot. So we put 2-pound charges inside the crook of each set of points. Perhaps halfway back to the forest, the explosions were sounding from the marshalling yard, one after the other. Nobody was hurt, nobody was challenged, nobody was accosted.
While Miller and Basden's operations were only just beginning, 1,000 miles east in the Balkans, armed resistance was already at full tilt. 600 SOE agents were fighting in a guerrilla war alongside the resistance. They were tying down 30 or so enemy divisions which were badly needed elsewhere. But first, they'd had to pick their way through the tangled web of local politics. "25-year-old Major Chris Woodhouse was invited into SOE because he could speak modern Greek. He had the unenviable task of bringing the rival Greek resistance factions together against the Germans.
I was miserable. I said, we'll have to do the best we can, and we did. It was worse and more difficult than I had foreseen.
Woodhouse had been fighting in Greece for 12 months and had already persuaded the rival groups to work together in the attack on the Gorgopotamus railway bridge. This uneasy alliance was not to last.
It was the only time the communists and the other fighters collaborated.
Woodhouse helped maintain peace between the rival groups, encouraging them where possible to needle the enemy with ambush and sabotage. One memorable success was the attack on the Asopos railway bridge. It kept Greece's principal rail line closed for over 4 months. To Woodhouse's delight, there was an added bonus.
The Asopos operation was truly brilliant, and the Germans rebuilt it very clumsily, and it collapsed and dropped into the riverbed. They killed 15 of their own employees by letting the bridge fall on them.
But what followed next was a disaster. General Infante was leader of an entire Italian division, part of the occupying forces in Greece. In September 1943, Woodhouse received astonishing news. Infante wanted to surrender.
Where it went wrong was when we distributed the Italians to small villages all over the area. What I dreaded did happen. The communists disarmed them.
The weapons from these 14,000 Italians changed the balance of power. Communists turned the guns on the other resistance groups. Woodhouse struggled to bring the leaders together to negotiate a ceasefire. The challenge he faced became apparent when Colonel Psaros, whom Woodhouse regarded as an honourable leader, didn't arrive at the talks.
When I reached the meeting place, I saw no sign of Psaros. I turned to the man from the communists and I said, "What's happened to Psaros?" And he replied in a Latin phrase, not in Greek, not in English, "Fuit," which literally means, "he has been." And of course it meant, "he is dead." It was the absolute swinishness of it that made my blood boil, because that was the first moment I knew that Psaros had been murdered.
The communists blighted any prospects of a lasting peace. Things were now so unstable that young Woodhouse was summoned back to England to advise Churchill in person on the situation.
When I left Churchill's house, he made that memorable remark to me, "I am very impressed and oppressed and depressed," but I think he was just thinking of the general situation in Greece.
If in Greece the resistance were only interested in fighting each other, the challenge in neighbouring Yugoslavia was to find anyone prepared to fight at all. German brutality against the civilian population had broken the back of any resistance. In desperation, SOE sent in agents to meet up with the remnants of the Yugoslav army. They were known as Chetniks and led by General Mihailovic. 27-year-old Eric Greenwood, an ex-commander, was one of the first to go in.
I was supposed to exhort the Yugoslavs to take action against the occupying troops, and if necessary to lead them doing it. After I landed, I put my parachute down in one place and sat off several yards away on one side with a revolver in my hand, wondering what to do. In due course, a soldier came over the crest of the hill and climbed down, and as he was carrying his rifle slung over his shoulder, I obviously had the draw on him, and I called out in Serbian, "Who goes there?" And he said, quite properly, "A soldier of King Peter." So I then got up and introduced myself and said what I'd always wanted, and many people had wanted to say. I said, "Take me to your leader," which he did. I was embraced by everybody and kissed heartily in both cheeks, and before we knew where we were, we consumed several bottles of rakia. 2 days after that, there were 2 airdrops came to me, so I was regarded as a kind of magician. All I had to do was to arrive, open up my radio set and have my operator send a signal, and the aircraft arrived. So I was extremely popular. Well, that didn't last. I was particularly supposed to arrange for the blocking of the Danube River, which was the main source of supply from Germany to the German forces. A perfect target for a guerrilla action. By the time August came round, I was pretty disillusioned. I could not get any action out of these people. I've subsequently learned Mihailovic was signaling his subordinate officers not to take any part in action against the enemy for the sake of the civilian population. But that was never imparted to us. They tried to put it off for other reasons. That they hadn't got enough arms, for example. They said, well, we can't defend anybody unless we're sufficiently armed, and we've only got 16 rifles between this 200 men and so on, which wasn't necessarily true. I would sometimes get quite angry and say, why can you not carry out the orders of the Supreme Headquarters? And I was once interrupted by saying, Major, they're not orders, they're requests. They didn't regard themselves as part of the Allied armies. They regarded themselves as a little team of their own.
If Yugoslavia was to play its part in the D-Day effort, there was no time for such inertia. The parachute drops of supplies began to reflect how low a priority the Chetniks had become, much to Greenwood's frustration.
On one occasion I wrote, as early as July in 1943, after I had requested an airdrop of clothing, that is uniforms, for the troops. A rude disappointment, only 17 pairs of trousers, 40 tunics, 50 pairs of old and very small boots, and a few shirts. That was one whole aircraft drop of somebody who had risked his life to fly from North Africa to the middle of Europe. I had colleagues spread over Serbia who received an electrical standard lamp, for which there was no conceivable use, a whole container full of onions, which were the only things available in Yugoslavia, and a container full of anti-snake venin for a country with no snakes. In March of 1944, I said, angrily signalled Cairo last night that we have stood by for over 100 nights for this sortie, and that we don't think it funny. And it wasn't funny, 100 nights out in the middle of the night waiting for one aircraft to appear, and nothing came.
Greenwood had not given up. He finally persuaded the Chetniks to stage an attack on the Danube supply barges. At the last minute, they reverted to their previous intransigence.
On the way, a courier arrived to catch me up with a long letter from the officer who'd agreed with me that this should be carried out, saying it must have been due to a misunderstanding on my part if I thought that he had agreed to it. But I ignored his letter and went on. The result of that was that within a few days the Germans announced that they had taken 100 hostages in Belgrade and shot them. The fact that they had these hostages shot, of course, was thrown in our faces by the local commander who said, "Oh, we told you so, you know. You can't do this sort of thing and have civilians shot." And that was difficult to gainsay, really. That was the only action we ever undertook there.
With D-Day imminent, the British authorities decided the Chetniks were a lost cause and pulled out Greenwood and the rest of the British.
And it worried us a great deal as to what would happen to us when we said to them one day, "Well, we're off." But in fact, nothing happened. We shook hands, embraced, and they said, "Well, you are soldiers and you're doing as you're ordered, and we're soldiers and we're doing as we're ordered, and we'll do what we're ordered together."
SOE had already found a different horse to back, one that was to play a critical part in the war and in the future of Europe. Yugoslav affairs were handled 1,200 miles away in SOE's Cairo office. They'd received the reports from Greenwood and others with mounting concern. Basil Davidson was head of SOE's Yugoslav section. He'd been desperate to get the resistance up and running.
I remember it as a nightmare. We're useless. We're not doing anything useful. We have to find wider resistance forces. Who are these wider resistance forces? We don't know. And then the first great breakthrough on the intelligence front came through.
Brigadier Keeble, head of the Cairo office, had obtained decryptions of German military radio traffic.
It was a top-secret German message saying that we are having great trouble with the partisans in Yugoslavia, in this place and in this place and in this place. Keeble said, you will draw up a map of where you think these partisans are and where we can contact them.
The decoded German messages revealed the existence of a huge rebel force in the Yugoslav mountains. Now SOE knew their location, but not whether they would cooperate with the Allies. William Deakin, Davidson's security officer, was sent in to make contact with the partisan leader, the mysterious Tito.
I myself went after Bill a few days later and met Tito also. And we were amazed at what we discovered. That we discovered an effective resistance movement of people who were determined to fight and who were perfectly ready to be our allies. Tito died in the war communist, of course, but a man you couldn't help respecting and admiring. He was a man of great courage. He said, you won't alter our politics. We're all going to be communists for as long as we know, but that means to say, for the time being, we're going to fight on your side.
It wasn't long before SOE had organized crucial help for Tito's poorly armed guerrillas. They arranged some of the biggest supply drops of the war. Dozens of men were sent in to train Tito's growing resistance army. Basil Davidson stayed on to fight with the partisans. Tito's men had now become a ruthless guerrilla army, unmoved by German reprisals against the civilian population. It was classic guerrilla warfare, a dangerous game of hide and seek.
The enemy would know, broadly speaking, that in this village or in that village probably there were partisans hiding. We would take refuge in Baza. Our Baza was a hole in the ground, usually in the farmyard covered in straw, and you would sit in there. Rather a creepy experience, of course, but you get beyond being frightened. You could hear them clumping around with their boots, you know.
Davidson, working with small bands of partisans, mounted forays, some lasting months, from the mountains into the German positions on the plains. Their preferred method of attack was the ambush.
Sometimes little boys who might be 8 or 9 years old, or 10, you know, small nippy lads, would creep up and throw their grenades into where the enemy was, and that would be the occasion to launch an attack. This happened all over the place again and again. War was a dreadful business. Don't let anybody suppose for a moment it was anything but horrible. It was all horrible. The only thing that could be done was to fight it and stop it and make certain it didn't happen again.
Davidson struggled on with the partisans until, returning across the Danube from an operation into Hungary, he heard some long-awaited news.
We got to the bank of the Danube, 8 or 9 of us. There was a steep bank you had to climb up. And at the top, I remember, was a young partisan commander whom I knew very well. And he said to me, "You have made an honest man of yourself." I said, "What do you mean? What's happened?" He said, the Allies have landed. Oh, the Allies have a drugi front. The second front has been opened.
"6th of June, 1944, the largest invasion in history. As the troops landed on the beaches, a fresh wave of SOE agents was parachuting behind enemy lines. They were to link up with the resistance. Everything the French did now would have to be carefully coordinated with the Allies. SOE had trained 100 or so special three-man teams, codenamed Jedburgh. One of the youngest was the Quinine team. Major Thomas Macpherson was 23, his radio operator Arthur Brown was 19, and his French lieutenant Michel de Bourbon was 18. Far from being undercover, the Jeds were to remain in uniform. In Macpherson's case, this was a kilt.
Our job was to create the maximum amount of disruption, to give a message to the French that the armies might have been a long time in penetrating the defences in Normandy, but the uniformed help was there on the spot in their own piece of the countryside. The Jeds wanted to draw attention to their presence.
As so often for SOE, Macpherson's first problem was overcoming wrangles amongst the various resistance groups.
I had no idea not only of the schism between the communists and the rest, but the diversity of the rest. They all operated under different alphabetical names. The AS, which was the Army Secret, the ORA, the Organization of Resistance of the Army, dozens of others. They all had their little agendas, and it was one of my tasks to try to concentrate their minds on the war and not the post-war.
Macpherson travelled by car between the various resistance groups, coordinating their actions.
As you drove round, you really never knew what you were going to meet round the next corner. You hoped it was nothing nasty. If we spotted a roadblock first, we reversed very sharply out of it. There would be an exchange of fire, but it's surprisingly difficult to hit a car moving at reasonable speed. I think most of us were living in an atmosphere of sheer mental terror most of the operation. It sharpens the senses very much. I hadn't been there very long before they put up posters in various towns offering enormous rewards for my apprehension.
On one occasion, he was having a celebratory drink with the mayor of Decazeville, having just sabotaged a German petrol dump, when he was caught by surprise.
We saw at the far end of this street 2 German armoured cars appear. We got back into that car with remarkable speed. They sent one of the armoured cars up to pursue me. There's a long hill out of Decazeville, and we were much quicker up the hill. So we thought we'd risk a bit of fun and manufactured a terribly simple device called a gammon grenade.
Macpherson soon had a big enough lead to hide the car and make his way up onto an overhead footbridge.
At the appropriate time, I leant over the bridge and dropped it. It blew the engine to bits and set the armoured car on fire.
Macpherson and his team spent the following week sabotaging telegraph lines, bridges and railways. But his favourite was blowing up the electric pylons carrying power to the factories of France.
There is a splendid noise of crumbling metal and sparks flying in every direction as the wires whip about and short and so forth. I used to enjoy that very much indeed.
For SOE's undercover agents like Yvonne Baisden, activity had moved up a gear since D-Day. The resistance was growing bolder. The result was the first ever daylight drop of arms and explosives, the daring Operation Cadillac.
As far as a Cadillac operation, of course it was extraordinary. I was in radio contact with the actual planes. When the planes came over, we could hear the roar of the engines, and already we had a lot of lorries gathered all around that particular area, which was very extensive. It was amazing. It was the middle of the morning in beautiful sunlight. We needed probably 800 people there on the ground to help move the material as quickly as possible.
The various resistance groups dispersed to their hideouts, while Baisden, Lucien and their compatriots went back to their base.
By the time we got back to headquarters, lunch had been organized by the concierge and his wife, and we sat down to what we thought was a reasonable lunch.
All of a sudden, the celebrations came to a halt.
The chap at the window said, "Les Boches," the Germans. We were horrified. We dispersed as quickly as we could to various hiding places within this large depot.
She hid behind several stacks of large cheeses piled up toward the front of the building.
Lucien went up on the floor above and I think hid under the floor. We heard all these cars drawing up around the depot. I had a chap there who was hiding with me. We couldn't talk or communicate in any way.
The Germans were following up on information extracted from a tortured resistance fighter. They found nothing. Nevertheless, they left one man on guard.
We were all anxious, I'm sure, that maybe with the approach of darkness, some of us might be able to escape. Suddenly, a sound within the depot meant that the man on duty decided there must be someone there and called the Germans back. They started to shoot randomly. It's only because blood came through the ceiling that they realized that there was someone between the floor and the ceiling. And they found eventually Lucien and one other man there. We were all found one by one. I was one of the first. We were thrown on the ground on our backs and taken by lorry to Dijon, which was a very big prison. I was interrogated, beaten up in various ways. Then I was dragged back up to the second floor. I could hardly come up the stairs, past an office full of people in uniform typing reports. Very extraordinary, with a sense of being someone else.
Meanwhile, in central France, Macpherson was becoming bolder in taking the fight to the enemy. He discovered that the crack Das Reich Panzer Division was racing through his area on its way to Normandy. It could be crucial for the German defences. Macpherson was going to try to delay it.
It was obvious that firing a few Sten guns at armoured vehicles was not going to bring the column to a halt. There were trees close to the road, and we conceived the idea of blowing these trees in such a way they fell across the road as an obstacle. The first area, we blew 2 trees down, quite a formidable barrier.
Before moving down the road, Macpherson left one of his men behind as an added surprise for the Germans.
The Germans drove up to this barrier. The column was led by a half-track, and the half-track had some troops in the back. Some of the troops got out, walked up to the barrier, scratched their heads, tried to push it out of the way, and of course couldn't. It was much too heavy.
The Germans were at a loss what to do. Everything stopped while they called up a bulldozer tank.
With some difficulty, it cleared the trees. The whole thing must have taken well over 3 hours. Then the tank was told to go in the front of the column. At that time, the man I'd left behind opened up with his Sten gun. Because it was coming from behind them, they had to swivel their guns round, so the chap was able to skip out of cover down the hill and disappear. What I did at the next barrier was to use the same technique, but well camouflaged with dust and gravel. I put our only 2 anti-tank mines. The tank came along, and this time they paused.
Expecting another ambush, the Germans then spent several hours searching the woods.
Then they gave the all clear, and the tank ploughed forward, and I'm happy to say, lost one track. It meant a very long delay while they sent for another heavy vehicle.
Macpherson used the delay to dash ahead and set up his third and final roadblock. He booby-trapped the trees to catch the soldiers he knew would be hunting for anti-tank mines.
Cumulatively, if you could imagine this in various degrees going on the whole 800-mile length of France, it contributed to a considerable delay in the projected arrival of these heavy reinforcements.
Closer to the German border, Miller was playing a stealthier game. His sabotage kept movements by rail in his area at a virtual standstill. Then a large armoured train pulled into a nearby siding.
I desperately wanted to blow it up. We took up a position behind a jolly good bank to avoid the obvious resistance that was going to come. And I fired the bazooka. The bazooka was a wonderful form of rocket, which I was dying to use. It sizzled off and struck these trucks, but it would simply light a fire in the middle of the truck. I was half mad at not having succeeded in blowing up this train.
In an act of sheer bravado, Miller decided to catch the Germans off guard by striking again the next morning. This time a covert attack using limpet mines, and just one other person, a teenager, to help him.
I had a new recruit in the Maquis, this boy called Nono, who'd pestered me and pestered me. And I took him on. Suddenly, we come to the top of the rise, and I realized there was an ambush, and German soldiers were rising from the tall wheat. A voice shouted, "Terrorist," and we started to pedal off like hell. Then Nono veered right off. He must have got hit, I think. I dashed down the hill, turned my bicycle at a very steep bank, and propelled myself forward into the undergrowth, scratching everything like mad. Then stopped to put 2 rounds from my .45 automatic into where I'd come from to stop German pursuit. Nono had been killed, poor chap.
This wasn't Miller's only lucky escape.
One time, Maurice and I were coming back from Besançon when we met a German patrolling the woods. I had my .45 in my jacket and shot him. Caught him in the middle of the chest. Maurice and I hauled him into the undergrowth because there was a lot of shouting and movement in the forest, and we had to lie beside him for a couple of hours while German patrols went past on the paths. The Germans killed 3 of my uncles in the First World War. It was they who made the war, they who chose to back that shit Hitler. The blue bottles were terrible, and they sort of dipped themselves in his blood and then came to sun themselves on us, you know. It was beastly. Anyway, he was a fine-looking chap. But him or you know, it's a different matter, isn't it?
Macpherson's boldest and most dangerous moment came at the end of August.
We drove in a captured German Red Cross car straight through the German lines at very high speed.
He was heading straight for the German military headquarters. Macpherson knew that an enemy column was heading his way and that his resistance fighters would be no match. He had decided to bluff the German commander-in-chief.
We sat down at 10 o'clock the following morning on a long table. The plan was that I should appear in full uniform and make it quite clear to Major General Elster, the commander of the Germans, that I had my battalion and a force of tanks and some guns across the river, and that he was welcome to come. I was very nervous, but suddenly I was hyped up for it. This was something that we just had to achieve, because if we didn't, there was going to be a lot of bloodshed, including me, I fancy. I must have given the right impression, because he agreed to sign surrender documents, and the German general and his colonel both passed across their personal weapons. And that was the end of the war for 23,000 Germans, and really the end of the resistance operation for most of the centre of France.
Macpherson's audacity had paved the way for the Allies to liberate central France. He and his team were fated as heroes in Dijon.
It was quite an emotional scene. As you can imagine, liberation and Vive la France and the Marseillaise and all that. It is a nice thing to remember.
Further east at the German border, Hitler had ordered his army to stand and fight. No enemy was to set foot on German soil. Miller and his Marquis were surrounded by German troops. He stepped up his operations until he received astounding news.
De Gaulle had it in his nut that British people had no right to be commanding French people, and he determined to root SOE out completely. I went, and so did all the others. I was a bit angry at the time. It was slightly undignified.
When Yvonne Beesden was captured and tortured, she was one of nearly 200 SOE agents arrested in France. Only a handful survived. For several weeks she had hoped for liberation by the advancing Allies. Then the Germans had decided to shoot or send away their prisoners. Beesden was herded onto a train heading for Germany.
I was very apprehensive. We didn't know what was going to happen, any of us. But it seemed like another page turned. We were moved to Ravensbrück. That is the first time we'd seen what a concentration camp really was. It was quite a shock. To my amazement and horror, when I went into the hut that I was directed to go to, I found friends of mine from SOE, Violette and Denise. The routine of the camp has been explained over the years. My number was 62,947. When you think that there were so many of us.
Yvonne Baisden spent 8 months in Ravensbrück. Then, with the Nazi regime collapsing, the Red Cross was able to strike a deal. 3 coaches would be allowed into Ravensbrück to take away a handful of inmates. Yvonne Baisden was one of them.
That was, of course, the first time that we saw Red Cross parcels in the coach. None of us had seen anything like that before. And some were most anxious to eat what they could. We managed to reach Denmark and cross into Denmark, where we were greeted.
She arrived back in London to an emotional reunion with her parents. The Germans surrendered a few days later. With the Allied victory, SOE's job was done. It had finally achieved greatness. There had only ever been 2,000 or 3,000 agents. Invariably they were young, but much had been expected of them. They had worked alone, in great danger, living by their wits. Many never came home.
What difference did it all make in the end? People got killed on both sides, and that was that. The war all seems rather stupid when it's over, but it's rather important when it's happening, isn't it?